Hey guys, Rob from Georgia here with you, aka VHS 82 apostrophe, with our final installment of this particular series, looking at H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West, Re-Animator. This is part 6, The Tomb Legions. All 6 pieces, of course, were first published for Home Brew, 1922. Ironically, a publication that was fresh, off the ground, but more lean towards humor. But for whatever reason, its editors wanted to enlist HP in a horror piece, but he was told, don't be too gruesome. In fact, it is published under the name of Grewsome Tales. So, anyways, part 6. This takes us into the climax. This is where HP has been leading us along the last 5 parts, with each part maybe getting a little bit more incredible. This leads us to the unknown. And so let's again begin with the summary, as so beautifully put by S.T. Joshi in his I Am Providence, The Life and Times of H.P. Lovecraft. Again, he says, referring to Herbert West Re-Animator in its 6 episodes, that they show West producing more and more hideous instances of reanimation. In the first, West injects a serum in a corpse, but it seems to produce no results. The 2 doctors bury the corpse in Potter's Field, only to learn later that it came to life after all. In the second, West impiously decides to resurrect Dr. Alan Halsey, who as head of the medical school had vigorously opposed West's experiments and had died in a typhoid epidemic that raged through Arkham. The creature is caught and locked up in Sefton Asylum. In the third, West and the narrator have set up a practice in the small Massachusetts town of Bolton, and attempt to resurrect the body of a black man. An amateur boxer named Buck Robinson, known as the Harlem Smoke, but seemed to find that the serum prepared from experience with white specimens only will not work on black corpses. Later, they learn otherwise. In the 4th episode, the narrator, returning from a vacation with his parents in Illinois, find West in a state of unusual excitement. He has designed an embalming fluid that will preserve a corpse in the state of freshness indefinitely, and claims that a traveling salesman who had come to visit West had died unexpectedly, would therefore serve as a perfect specimen because of the freshness of the corpse. When it is reanimated, the narrator finds that West's account of the matter is perhaps not wholly accurate. The 5th episode took us to the horrors of the Great War, where West and the narrator have enlisted in a Canadian regiment in 1915. West now seeks to put into practice still more eccentric views on reanimation of the dead, and does so in a loathsome manner. And finally, and I'll only read this in part as to save or to avoid spoilers, the 6th episode finds the 2 doctors in Boston after the war, and we'll end there. I do want to highlight or begin with a quote again. This time from our narrator of Lovecraft's work, The Shadow Out of Time. Again, in warning people of venturing too far in to places that one ought not to go, the ultimate end may be this. Then man must be prepared to accept notions of the cosmos and of his own place in the seething vortex of time, whose merest mention is paralyzing. He must, too, be placed on guard against specific lurking peril, which, though it will never engulf the whole race, may impose monstrous and unguessable horrors upon certain venturesome members of it. I love it. I love it because this is fitting for the climax of one Herbert West, and ultimately what may be his demise. We shall see. Herbert West, Re-Animator, originally published under the title Grewsome Tales in Home Brew, Volume 1, numbers 1 through 6, February through July, 1922. Part 6. The Tomb Legions. When Dr. West disappeared a year ago, the Boston police questioned me closely. They suspected I was holding something back, perhaps suspected even graver things. But I could not tell them the truth because they would not have believed it. They knew indeed that West had been connected with activities beyond the credence of ordinary men, for his hideous experiments on the reanimation of dead bodies had long been too extensive to admit of perfect secrecy. But the final soul-shattering catastrophe held elements of demonic fantasy which make even me doubt the reality of what I saw. I was West's closest friend and only confidential assistant. We had met years before in medical school, and from the first I had shared his terrible researches. He had slowly tried to perfect a solution which, injected into the veins of a newly deceased, would restore life, a labor demanding an abundance of fresh corpses and therefore involving the most unnatural actions. Still more shocking were the products of some of the experiments, grisly masses of flesh that had been dead but that West waked to a blind, brainless, nauseous animation. These were the usual results, for in order to reawaken the mind, it was necessary to have specimens so absolutely fresh that no decay could possibly affect the delicate brain cells. This need for very fresh corpses had been West's moral undoing. They were hard to get, and one awful day he had secured a specimen while it was still alive and vigorous. A struggle, a needle, and a powerful alkaloid had transformed it into a very fresh corpse, and the experiment had succeeded for a brief and memorable moment. But West had emerged with a soul calloused and seared, and a hardened eye which sometimes glanced with a kind of hideous, calculating appraisal at men of especially sensitive brain and especially vigorous physique. Toward the last, I became acutely afraid of West, for he began to look at me that way. People did not seem to notice his glances, but they noticed my fear, and after his disappearance used that as a basis for some absurd suspicion. West, in reality, was more afraid than I, for his abominable pursuits entailed a life of furtiveness and dread of every shadow. Partly it was the police he feared, but sometimes his nervousness was deeper and more nebulous, touching on certain indescribable things which he had injected a morbid life, and from which he had not seen that life depart. He usually finished his experiments with a revolver, but a few times he had not been quick enough. There was that first specimen on whose rifled grave marks the clawing were later seen. There was also that Arkham professor's body, which had done cannibal things before it had been captured and thrust unidentified into a madhouse cell at Sefton, where it beat the walls for 16 years. Most of the other possibly surviving results were things less easy to speak of, for in later years West's scientific zeal had degenerated to an unhealthy and fantastic mania, and he had spent his chief skill in vitalizing not entire human bodies, but isolated parts of bodies, or parts joined to organic matter other than human. It had been fiendishly disgusting by the time he disappeared. Many of the experiments could not even be hinted at in print. The great war through which both of us served as surgeons had intensified this side of West. In saying that West's fear of his specimens was nebulous, I have in mind particularly its complex nature. Part of it came merely from knowing of the existence of such nameless monsters, while another part arose from apprehension of the bodily harm they might, under certain circumstances, do him. Their disappearance added horror to the situation. Of them all, West knew the whereabouts of only one, the pitiful asylum thing. Then there was a more subtle fear, a very fantastic sensation resulting from a curious experiment in the Canadian Army in 1915. West, in the midst of severe battles, had reanimated Major Sir Eric Moreland Clapham Lee, DSO, a fellow physician who knew about his experiments and could have duplicated them. The head had been removed so that the possibilities of quasi-intelligent life in the trunk might be investigated. Just as the building was wiped out by a German shell, there had been success. The trunk had moved intelligently and unbelievable to relate. We were both sickeningly sure that articulate sounds had come from the detached head as it lay in the shadowy corner of the laboratory. The shell had been merciful in a way, but West could never feel as certain as he wished that we too were the only survivors. He used to make shuddering conjectures about the possible actions of a headless physician with the power of reanimating the dead. Wesley last quarters were in a venerable house of much elegance overlooking one of the oldest burying grounds in Boston. He had chosen the place for purely symbolic and fantastically aesthetic reasons, since most of the interments were of a colonial period and therefore of little use to a scientist seeking very fresh bodies. The laboratory was in a sub-cellar secretly constructed by imported workmen and contained a huge incinerator for the quiet and complete disposal of such bodies, or fragments and synthetic mockeries of bodies, as might remain from the morbid experiments and unhallowed amusements of the owner. During the excavation of this cellar, the workmen had struck some exceedingly ancient masonry, undoubtedly connected with the old burying ground, yet far too deep to correspond with any known sepulture therein. After a number of calculations, West decided that it represented some secret chamber beneath the tomb of Averroes, where the last interment had been made in 1768. I was with him when he studied the nitrous-dripping walls laid bare by the spades and mattocks of the men, and was prepared for the gruesome thrill which would attend the uncovering of centuried grave secrets. But for the first time, West's new timidity conquered his natural curiosity, and he betrayed his degenerating fiber by ordering the masonry left intact and plastered over. Thus there remained till that final hellish night part of the walls of the secret laboratory. I speak of West's decadence, but must add that it was purely mental and intangible thing. Outwardly he was the same to the last, calm, cold, slight, yellow-haired, with spectacled blue eyes, and a general aspect of youth which years and fears seemed never to change. He seemed calm even when he thought of that clawed grave, looked over his shoulder, and even when he thought of the carnivorous thing that gnawed and pawed at the septum bar. The end of Herbert West began one evening in our joint study when he was dividing his curious glance between the newspaper and me. A strange headline item had struck him from the crumpled pages. A nameless Titan claw had seemed to reach down through 16 years. Something fearsome and incredible had happened at Sefton Asylum 50 miles away, stunning the neighborhood and baffling the police. In the small hours of the morning, a body of silent men had entered the grounds, and their leader had aroused the attendants. He was a menacing military figure who talked without moving his lips, and whose voice seemed almost ventriloquently connected with an immense black case he carried. His expressionless face was handsome to the point of radiant beauty, but had shocked the superintendent when the hall light fell on it, for it was a wax face with eyes of painted glass. Some nameless accident had befallen this man. A larger man guided his steps, a repellent hulk whose bluish face seemed half eaten away by some unknown malady. The speaker had asked for a custody of the cannibal monster committed from Markham 16 years before. Upon being refused, gave a signal which had precipitated a shocking riot. The fiends had beaten, trampled, and bitten every attendant who did not flee, killing 4 and finally succeeding in the liberation of the monster. These victims, who could recall the event without hysteria, swore that the creatures had acted less like men than like unthinkable automata guided by the wax-faced leader. By the time help could be summoned, every trace of the men and of their mad charge had vanished. From the hour of the reading this item until midnight, West sat almost paralyzed. At midnight the doorbell rang, startling him fearfully. All the servants were asleep in the attic, so I answered the bell. As I have told police, there was no wagon in the street, but only a group of strange-looking figures bearing a large square box, which they deposited in the hallway after one of them had grunted in a highly unnatural voice. Express prepaid. They filed out of the house with a jerky tread, and as I watched them go, I had an odd idea that they were turning around toward the ancient cemetery on which the back of the house abutted. When I slammed the door after them, West came downstairs and looked at the box. It was about 2 feet square, bore West's correct name and address. It also bore the inscription, "From Eric Moreland Clapham Lee, St. Eloi, Flanders." 6 years before in Flanders, a shelled hospital had fallen under the headless, reanimated trunk of Dr. Clapham Lee, and upon the detached head, which perhaps had uttered articulate sounds. West was not even excited now. His condition was more ghastly. Quickly he said, "It's the finish, but let's incinerate this." He carried the thing down to the laboratory, listening. I do not remember many particulars. You can imagine my state of mind, but it is a vicious lie to say it was Herbert West's body which I put into the incinerator. We both inserted whole unopened box, closed the door, started the electricity, nor did any sound come from the box after all. It was West who first noticed the fallen plaster on that part of the wall where the ancient tomb masonry had been covered up. I was going to run, but he stopped me. Then I saw a small black aperture, felt a ghoulish wind of ice, and smelled the carnal balls of putrescent earth. There was no sound, but just then the electric lights went out, and I saw outlined against some phosphorescence of the netherworld a horde of silent, toiling things which only insanity or worse could create. Their outlines were human, semi-human, fractionally human, and not human at all. The horde was grotesquely heterogeneous. They were removing stones quietly, one by one, from a century wall, and then as the breach became large enough, they came out into the laboratory in a single file, led by the stalking thing with a beautiful head made of wax. A sort of mad-eyed monstrosity behind the leaders seized on Herbert West. West did not resist or utter a sound. Then they all sprang at him and tore him to pieces before my eyes, bearing the fragments away into the subterranean vault of fabulous abominations. West's head was carried off by a wax-headed leader who wore a Canadian officer's uniform. As it disappeared, I saw that the blue eyes behind the spectacles were hideously blazing with their first touch of frantic, visible emotion. Servants found me unconscious in the morning. West was gone. The incinerator contained only unidentifiable ashes. Detectives have questioned me, but what can I say? The theft and tragedy they will not connect with West. Not that, nor the men with the box, whose existence they deny. I told them of the vault, and they pointed to the unbroken plaster wall and laughed. So I told them no more. They imply that I am either a madman or a murderer. Probably I am mad. But I might not be mad if those accursed tomb legions had not been so silent. End of Part 6, The Tomb Legions, as well as the end of Herbert West, Re-Animator, written by H.P. Lovecraft, in a 6-part to the Home Brew publication, 1922. So Herbert West, Re-Animator. Now you've got 3 films, of course: Re-Animator, Stuart Gordon, Brian Yuzna's Bride of a Re-Animator, and Brian Yuzna's Beyond Re-Animator. I have not... If I've seen it, I rented it on VHS when I was a kid, and I really don't remember it. But I do plan on grabbing it at some point if I can find it well enough. I think I saw a copy on Amazon DVD for not much. So, it isn't, it's, so my three favorite pieces, probably The Plague Demon, Horror Out of the Shadows, that involves World War I, and The Tomb Legions, the finality, the climax of the story. I love The Plague Demon. I love the whole creature that kills what I think it was 14 people, just going into houses and just ravaging. It reminds me of Joe D'Amato's Anthropophagus, and it does make me really wonder if Joe D'Amato had not read Lovecraft and read Re-Animator and latched onto that specific piece and said, you know what? How about a cannibal let loose on a small Greek island that basically just sets forth a plague, in which case then our heroes, as they will be, land on the island, and then run afoul of this hideous thing. Of course, that film, 1980, will go on to be on the video nasty list in the UK. Really, there's only one scene in the entire movie that deserves that at all, and not even that, but of course, part of the end climax. It really does make me wonder, though. Herbert, or I was going to say Herbert West. Well, as an extension of H.P. Lovecraft, a lot of his characters are an extension of himself. But Lovecraft, man, I just absolutely just love him. I cannot get enough of him, and it's been fun revisiting in a much more scrutinizing way, I think, or closely attentive way, looking at these 6 pieces, and of course reinvesting myself in the film. Of course, the catalyst for all of this was me and the guys doing the Bride of the Re-Animator show for Valentine's Day, which the link is down below. You can access that link, and I think it's the YouTube link. Of course, you can find the same show on Spotify, whichever is easier, and check out our thoughts of and then some of those thoughts I give were related, I guess, in the piece of the Great War, which was part 5, Baudelaire, and just some of the things about that a lot of people may not know. So anyways, I'm not going to be late anymore. This was great. I hope you enjoyed it, especially the way I decided to go about it. I just want to thank S.T. Joshi, whom I've become just a huge fan of, and all the work that he has put into being the Lovecraft historian. Of course, Lovecraft himself and all his wonderful work. It's really too bad he didn't or was not appreciated in his own time as much as he is now. Much of what he has written has just saturated our culture. I mean, look no further than Alien, and just movies like that you can just see cosmic horror. And thank God for Richard Stanley and for his piece, Color Out of Space. And he is working on, for those, any of you still listening to me, he is, I believe, greenlit now to work on a 2-part piece for the Dunwich Horror. Cannot wait to see what that looks like. So anyways, I'm going to just go ahead and end here. Thank you for traveling along with me if you did, and I'll probably not invest myself in another story for a little bit, but when that time comes, hopefully it's I'll try to pick a good one. As always, we end these things off with Go Bills.
This is not a dream. Not a dream.
We might be useful to you.